I did see people on stream give up. One of my most inaccessible games, but one of my best. My level design was on point.
The End is Nigh is a video game so vicious that it wants you dead more than an argumentative Reddit moderator. You control Ash, a streamer turned slime thing that wants to assemble a friend for himself out of different body parts scattered throughout the world, with nothing but pure platforming standing in the way. And if that sounds familiar, it might be because I've done a review on this game already. If you'd like to just know what my thoughts are this time around, go to the time code you see on screen. If you'd like to know why I'm giving this title another look, stay right where you are. My last review of The End is Nigh was met with some conflict. Some understandable, some I want to address. One criticism that surprised me, even though it really shouldn't have, is that I constantly compared this game to its skinless predecessor, Super Meat Boy. People were worried that I was going in with a predetermined set of expectations, trying to pigeonhole End is Nigh into a game it wasn't, and ultimately end up judging it unfairly. Judging a fictional version of a game that I had constructed in my mind instead of the standalone game The End is Nigh actually is. I did touch on this exact concern in my last review, but I think there's partial merit to the criticism I received, so let me explain my reasoning in the last video, and then tell you what I'm going to do differently here. There are a handful of reasons I compared The End is Nigh to Super Meat Boy so much in the previous review, and one of them is because, obviously, McMillen had set expectations for himself with that game. And because it wasn't his first foray into platformers, the comparison was very useful as a tool for gauging quality and explaining what the title is like. Even if Nigh and Meat Boy don't set out to fulfill the exact same thing as each other, there is enough carryover that holding The End is Nigh up to what is McMillen's most well-known platformer is more than deserving of time. Even if you think Nigh is a better game, placing it next to a well-received title in the same genre by the same person clearly has advantages for communicating points on design, but it also has some disadvantages, and it's that reviewing End is Nigh from this angle could invite unfair context. Is not being able to wall jump necessarily a bad thing? Not really, but I somewhat implied it in my last review. I don't think overall this had a negative effect on my previous video, but just in case, I've decided to play it safe this time around and ignore Meat Boy as a point of reference entirely. So let's go ahead and try once again.
Okay, we're going to load up one of my favorite games here. Here we have The End is Nigh.
The End is Nigh quickly communicates its standards and design within its opening minutes. Movement is steady, deliberate, and measured. There are no running starts, sprint buttons, or fancy backflips here. What you have at your disposal at the start is what you'll have for the rest of the game. There's no level or world select. The game simply starts and flows. You have a jump, ledge grab, fast fall, and wide jump, with wide jumps being performed by leaping away from the ledge you're hanging from. Your maneuverability in the air is really flexible, and the sheer amount of control will probably throw you off and land you in spikes until you get the hang of it. Chunks of floors, ceilings, and buildings tend to fall and reveal secrets as you navigate obstacles, and you'll find yourself wondering if it's worth trekking back in the middle of a screen often to nab a collectible. Slowly gaining the muscle memory required to beat some of these stages is really gratifying. Good platformer level design usually involves placing as few elements as possible on screen, yet still extracting interesting movement from the player, and at its best, Nigh manages to do just that. Water, springs, and drop-down platforms do enough to set each world apart, and even if they are all things you've seen in other video games, Edmund shows us that he knows what he's doing enough that even with very fundamental tools like these, he's able to make engaging level design. The latter half of the game in particular sets up some really clever situations. You'll be narrowly dodging projectiles, gaping demon mouths, and even water. For the most part, no matter how hard the later parts of the game become, pixel-perfect precision is never needed. Even if it pushes it at times, there is always at least some margin for error, so with enough practice you're able to consistently reproduce what you've learned in each level. I say for the most part because there were a handful of moments where a screen was super demanding and I didn't feel confident in being able to reproduce my success, such as one where 50 of these fish enemies were placed in a body of water and I feel like I just got lucky managing to dodge them. For the vast majority of this game though, McMillen demonstrates that he knows the difference between a level that's really hard and good from a level that's just hard because of it, which just makes it all the more disappointing when he decides to pull stuff like this. Having these lesser segments sandwiched between good ones just makes them stand out even more, and it leaves a bad taste that overshadows 8 good screens you might have gone through beforehand. Yet, even in the well-designed areas, lots of optional collectibles simply involve hurtling yourself towards the bottom of the screen and doing the same challenge again. For a good chunk of the game though, item placement is considered, well-crafted, and makes you transverse the layout in a neat way. One type of item you'll find out in the world is cartridges, which give you access to optional stages in an 8-bit aesthetic. These 8-bit stages may have the exact same physics as the standard levels, but they're a neat diversion. Some give you a limited number of lives to beat several areas strung together, others give you a single life to complete multiple stages in a row. And if the limited number of tries sounds kind of artificial, it's because, well, it is. These areas don't introduce any new moves or maneuvers, they're simply what you've seen elsewhere with a limited number of lives stacked on top of it and a new coat of paint. But it ends up feeling less artificial than you'd think, since these places are tailor-made for the limitation. The areas you have to beat in a row with one life are easier than the normal ones, for example. At least, some of them. 8-bit stages aren't the only ones where you'll have a limited amount of tries, though. The second half of the game takes place in a harder, remixed version of the previous half, and on top of that, you only have a limited amount of lives to complete them. These lives are based on how many collectibles you managed to find in the prior worlds. Basically, you'll have to participate in the game's optional content to complete just the normal levels. And while it may sound concerning having the later worlds just be varied iterations of the beginning ones, it ends up not being as big an issue as you'd think, since the changes make them feel wholly different than how they were before. Inadvertently forcing the player to collect stuff that should be an optional challenge is a mixed bag though. For one, it can push players outside of their comfort zone and make them feel a lot of gratification in doing an unorthodox challenge. On the other, it can feel cheap to have to tread back and do areas you've done already because the game decided to put an artificial number in the way of your progress. I'm sure that would have frustrated me if I hadn't already gotten 300 lives prior to the whole thing from obsessively looking for secrets, but it was kind of rewarding to rerun some of the areas with my newfound skills after playing for so long and collect some secrets I hadn't gotten before. It can be vexing. But if the standard game stages are too vexing, you're welcome to try and design some yourself. There's a level editor that's fairly intuitive and lets you more or less match any developer-made screen in the normal story. You can tweak colors, enemies, and even music. The End is Nigh's soundtrack leans very heavily into impending doom. Boisterous and ominous instrumentals encompass your attempts at trying to overcome the game's challenges. It's not meant to uplift and motivate, it's there to intimidate and frighten, almost angering you into beating these levels just despite it. While they are well-made tracks, it is at direct odds with the overall gameplay loop. To illustrate my point, I'll direct you to Dust Force, another difficult indie platformer. Tracks in Dust Force are equal parts beautiful, atmospheric, and zen-inducing, and it complements playing these really hard levels over and over again perfectly. If, as a game developer, you know that the player is going to lose many times on the same area to progress, there's almost no good reason to play tracks that are so tiring to listen to. Again, The End is Nigh's OST is great, truly, but hearing some of these songs over and over again after being stuck in the same area for so long is really draining. Perhaps this was Edmund's intent.
And it was kind of a re-envisioning of Meat Boy in a way when it came to the difficulty aspect, where Meat Boy was like, Meat Boy is about challenging yourself because the outcome is worth it. And The End is Nigh is about challenging yourself and questioning if the outcome is worth it. I wanted to make a game that felt like you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never drops and you don't know when. And I wanted to make a game about stress and anxiety, and I wanted to make a game about a life falling apart.
If you haven't been able to tell from all the footage you've seen, Edmund's games have always had a sadistic edge to them, yet they're interwoven with a nihilistic humor, a self-deprecating obsession with themselves that reminds us never to take anything too seriously. And I don't mean the kind of self-deprecating that you'd see in a Discord venting channel. I mean the kind that's actually funny, propped right next to the doom and gloom that permeates a lot of the experience. And wouldn't you know it, the end is nigh is depressing as fuck. Buildings sog and hang over ash with giant indifference, rain floods into apartments at an endless rate, and even the friend you assemble from severed body parts implies that he hates you despite being inanimate. Yet regardless of all of that, most of the uncaring and cold nature of this game isn't felt in its cutscenes, looks, or characters. It's felt in the gameplay itself, and for all the reasons I've stated earlier, the game achieves this with mixed results. The End is Nigh is not a 10 out of 10 video game. The world is littered with tiny little inconveniences and blemishes. Soft locks and technical hiccups aren't even the worst of your concerns. There's this area in the Wall of Sorrow that sends you back several segments every time you fall, instead of outright respawning you since you drop into a previous screen, though that issue in particular is resolved in the remake. The End is Nigh remake is a fan endeavor that ups the visuals, fixes the screen problems mentioned earlier, adds some clarity to certain obstacles, and more. The project's almost finished and can be downloaded via the Steam Workshop. If you've yet to even touch this game, you may as well wait just a little bit longer for this to be done, since it's probably the best way to experience it, provided you don't mind missing out on achievements. I gave it a shout out in my last video, and I'm going to do so again here. The developer behind the remake has an even more ambitious project in the works as well, Shattered Spectrum. Shattered Spectrum is a developer-endorsed fan-made expansion that is going to be outright larger than the original release. It's got cutscenes, new level objects, and its own original tracks, or at least it will have its own original tracks after a composer has been found. If that's something you're in the business of, the relevant links to get started on applying for the project are in the video description. We've gotten a little sidetracked, so to put a cap on all of this, in my previous review I had said that The End is Nigh is like a well-made hamburger with no extra toppings. Carefully crafted and good tasting, but not exactly fancy. I still hold to that thought, but a more accurate descriptor might have been that it's a well-made hamburger that was crafted with hands that could have been washed a little bit better. The screen issues are annoying, sometimes you crave for something a little bit more, but overall it's easy to lay back and just enjoy the taste. Here's a review I did for Super Meat Boy Forever. It's a common thing to say, I know, but a comment, like, and subscription truly do go a long way in helping the channel grow. So if you liked what you saw today, please do so. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.